Okay, so welcome everybody. It's November, I think it's the 14th today. This is Chandra Easton here and doing a bit of an update on what's happening with the rollout of the digital ID in Australia. So I'll show you the various things what I'm going to talk about. About the e-safety law when it was proposed and what I've understood to be phase one. I'll show you the chart for uh, the 10th of November. I'll be talking about what I consider to be a softly approach on behalf of the powers that be. Talk about the global game plan and who I consider to be truth warriors in this battle that's going on. We'll talk about phase two that's starting at the end of December and briefly look at the chart for that. And then look at some of the past, the present, and the future scenarios. Okay, because it is a different world that we're entering into towards the end of 2025 to do with the use of the internet. And of course, if I hit the record button, I did, yes. And of course, this is not just Australia, it's all around the planet this is happening. But in Australia, it's referred to as the e-safety law, which I think is a bit of a joke and a bit of a propaganda stunt to sort of make us believe that this is for our safety. And I only recently discovered, literally a day or two ago, that there was more than one phase and that we're only getting phase one on the 10th of December. So it was about a year ago that it was announced. And in fact, this has been in the woodwork and been in the planning for us in the Australian government for at least 9 months and probably longer before that. It was by May this year that they decided to have a bit of a trial, and the trial was undertaken by businesses that they asked the opinion really of different telecommunications and other industry people to sort of see what was going to work, and they ran the trial for, I think it was until the end of August. By the middle of September, there were final rules announced. So they say they announced them, but in actual fact, I didn't see anything about it. So they weren't announced to the general public. They announced them very quietly. And what I've just discovered is that they backpedaled on some of their initial statements. And they also changed the name of it. And so instead of it being for digital ID, they referred to it as a digital age assurance trial. And that's very political. I've left the word digital out there, but it's a digital age assurance rather than digital identity. And there's a reason for that, and the reason I'll get to in a little while. And in the background of what was happening here in Australia, the Australian government employed a British company to write a report about this, 1,000 pages apparently. This came out of the trial. Why on earth there was a British company? Maybe because the Brits have been working on it longer and had more information about it. Anyway, the implementation, the putting it into law in Australia is the 10th of December 2025. And of course, the reason why such a thing would be accepted by the general public is because there's been an enormous amount of harm that's happened online through online bullying with teenagers, to say nothing of kids going off to sites they shouldn't go to. And so that's the sort of the front door or the rationale for the reason why this digital ID was being rolled out. They didn't actually explain why they'd changed it to a digital age assurance trial, but I realised when I listened to some of the people on the committee what was going on. And to me, it just sounds like doublespeak. It's a technology trial, and they've, rather than having a one size fits all, everybody over 16 is going to be tested to prove their age and to verify their age, they've backed away and taken a much more flexible approach. And I was listening to some of the people who were on the committee who are making up the rules, and basically they admitted that they were testing the water to see how much the Australian population the populace en masse would put up with, and what would people prepared to wear. Yeah, and they admitted that. I heard them say it. They wanted to know how much were the consumers willing to comply. And they're using a stick, meaning, they're threatening very large fines for all the internet companies and various platforms if they don't come to the party. And then the carrot is for the general Australian populace, trying to convince us that this is solely for the benefit of the teenagers and the younger people to protect them from harm. But really, underneath all of that, the reality is that it's actually illegal in Australian law to enforce Australian citizens to sign up and to have to provide digital identity. It's actually illegal under Australian law. So this is why there's this backpedaling. But the thing that struck me was that they didn't come out and announce it. Actually, we've done this trial. We've realised that we're breaking the law. We can't do it, and so we're going to backpedal. There was simply no public announcement. I had to do quite a bit of digging to discover this. And I think this was deliberate ambiguity, because what they hope is that people will simply feel as if they have no other choice and they have to comply. It's being referred to, so the approach that they've settled upon is being referred to as a waterfall approach, where they will make concessions according to how we use the internet. So there will be random checks for everybody who holds a social media account. They don't say how random. This is a very large undertaking. And one of the other things that I discovered as I was doing the research was that they simply don't have the staff to police what it was they said they were going to do. So of course they have to do it randomly. They've said that there will be no new accounts issued for people under 16. Yeah, so that's two new things. It's going to be random rather than arbitrary for everybody. No new accounts. One of the other concessions, this is to give the appearance, I think, that really they're doing it with our best interests at heart, is that parents can now give consent for their teenagers to share their devices. Yeah, so this is a very large concession that's happened. But they're still maintaining the option of estimating the age of an individual who's using social media through biometric data. But because it's illegal to insist on this, they're wanting people to volunteer it. Yeah? Volunteer your voice, volunteer your face, but they're not telling people it's illegal. They're just sort of offering it as one of the many options. Other optional things are you can voluntarily hand over your name, your mobile phone, your email contacts, things like that. And I think what they're hoping is that people will feel like we have no choice and they'll just simply comply and sign up. So there's been no transparency in what's happened from when it was announced 12 months ago to the changes that came in after, I think it was the 1st of September. And of course, it does smack very much like 1984. Yeah, okay. And because, of course, one of the things they've realised is when they're trying to gather the data and analyse the data of however many, I don't know, we've got 25 million or 26 million Australians, how many are online and have social media accounts? I don't know. Is it 50%, 60%? Who knows? But they've realised that it's an impossible task. And so they're going to have to work around. And what they're planning on doing is randomly analysing the behavioural habits of people online, the kinds of things you post. Do you post at night time? Do you post during school hours? Do you only post after school hours? Because in this way, I think they're thinking they can figure out who are the under 16s. And of course, what happens when you establish a social media account is generally you're asked for your age and you're asked for your birth date. Well, I lied about that myself years ago. I never told them my birth date or my age. And many younger people have done exactly the same thing. But they're also going to check who are you talking to, who are your friends. And of course, this is fraught with danger because it's guesswork. Just because you're talking to someone 14 doesn't necessarily mean you're age 14. They'll also be investigating and going into what is supposed to be private messages between friends on social media. Well, of course, that's an absolute joke. There will be no privacy. I think that messenger option is not coming until the end of December. And the other thing is, because they've realised that the younger people are very tech savvy and will simply, cover their tracks and or use VPNs, virtual private networks, then anyone who they suspect of using a VPN, they're going to dig very deeply into their account. And of course, the other thing that they'll be doing to gather all this data is how long have you had your account? If you had your account for 10 years, well, you're probably more than 16, but not necessarily, So the whole thing's very hit and miss. And many people will simply work around it, the various approaches, not the least of which will be the teenagers. Okay, there's another thing that's happening. There's something called Know Your Customer, otherwise known as the acronym of KYC. And this is what happens to everybody if you shop online or do anything online. You get followed so that you can see where you shop or where you go, because all the consumer information is driven by digital data. So there's a merger happening between the KYCs, which have been basically to track us and harass us with advertising or whatever when we're online, and merge that with this new digital verification. So there's as many ways to try and catch people in terms of their location, their age, their shopping preferences, etc. So many people, myself included, have never given anyone my date of birth or my age, or indeed my location. But that's the sort of data that they're looking for. Now, previously it was called age verification, and I've highlighted these two things here just to point out the difference between the terminology age verification, that's the illegal one, versus age assurance, which is the new language the government's using to encourage people to hand over their data. And I discovered that it's actually illegal for the that they demand any government-issued ID. So they can't demand your passport or your Centrelink paperwork or any other things, your Medicare, whatever it is. It's illegal to do that when they're going on with this age assurance. What they hope is that you will volunteer it. And that's the reason why they've put those official legal documents in amongst all the other ways they're going to catch the data. So the guidelines were actually outlined in the middle of October. That's about a month ago, isn't it? And it was about then that the commissioner, the e-safety commissioner, resigned, and I think she's seeing out her term. But I think she said the pressures were too great because there's been an enormous amount of flack that's happened. There are some exclusions. Something called Google Classroom, which I didn't know exists, which apparently the teachers will be very happy that the children will still be allowed to go to that. The Kids Helpline for kids in distress, online gaming, and a couple of other things I can't remember. But a little bit of exclusions, but very tokenistic. And the important thing to remember here is that age-restricted social media platforms can only collect government-issued identification and information or material if other alternative age assurance methods have been provided as optional to the users. But of course, they haven't been telling us this. They've been just saying you're going to have to hand over your ID and have your biometrics scanned, whereas in fact, now we discover that there's all these other things that can be done. The younger people can get their parents and so on. And so really, I think that there's been a great amount of muddying the waters, a great amount of out and out covering their tracks or lying, trying to sell the e-safety as something that will keep people safe and free, whereas in fact, it's a pathway that pushes people into the digital slavery if they don't understand what it is that's legal and what's not. Okay, I've got the chart here and I'll just point out a couple of things on the chart. I cast the chart for midnight because that's when I assume it's midnight when this will become law in Australia, the age assurance rollout for the 10th of December. And the first thing I noticed, and I cast it for Canberra, first thing I noticed was the past life point sitting right on the ascendant. So that's a very interesting thing because, the ascendant is meant to be a way that we progress and grow personally and spiritually. And yet the past life point is a retrograde, a backward step. So it looks like a backward step for Australia rather than a forward step. And then the destiny point, the north node, is in the hidden position over here in the sunset position in Pisces. So it's very difficult for us to know what will be the final outcome because it's hidden in the far distance. But this clearly has a bit of a retrograde step, I would say. And then when I looked up the Sabian symbol for this 14th degree of Virgo, it says a family tree. And I immediately thought, well, that's your genetics, that's your biometrics, that's your DNA that comes from your mother and your grandmother and all the way back through the family line. So I found that a little interesting. Other thing to notice is the big mutable grand cross. Yeah, I've got my glasses on here, and that goes from the earth up the top and the midheaven, the ascendant and the south node, the sun and the north node in this hidden obscured position. It's the big mutable grand cross. And generally with a mutable grand cross, if it's in an individual's chart, people often get confused or lost in their life direction and they go off on a track somewhere and it takes them 1 or 2 or half a dozen lifetimes to come backwards. It's a kind of a confusing pattern. Yeah. Other things that I noticed was, I think the attempt to force everybody into the digital identity has got a great deal to do with Pluto in these early degrees of Aquarius. And if you see this dotted red line here, that's a semi-square down to the sun, another dotted red line, sesquiquadrate up to the earth. And that's the pattern referred to as the SOS, which I often think of as a help pattern. It's a distress call. So it looks to me that the control mechanisms of the Pluto put the individual's identities in distress. And yet I suppose you could say with the mutable grand cross, people will fall through the cracks. It's unlikely that it's actually going to work because it's very hit or miss, the mutable grand cross. We did talk, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, about this strong square between Chiron and Jupiter. And to me, that's the challenge to sort of find the fine line between what are the rights that I have as an individual that I think are essential for my own well-being, and how do I balance that against other people's needs. And so, of course, we've been sold and told that the e-safety law, that everybody needed to hand over their data to keep the teenagers safe. Well, that kind of reminds me a few years ago when everybody was told we all have to wear masks and have shots in the arm to keep the elderly safe. So again, I think there's a muddying of the waters and there's a distortion happening. And I see that as this, because Jupiter in Cancer, people love and care for family members and community. And a lot of people who are very concerned about teenagers and harm happening online would go, okay, well, this is what we have to do. Whereas I just think it's just a deluded front door. Other things I noticed, well, of course, there are 4 planets in Sagittarius. I'm not quite sure how I'd interpret that in terms of this period. I suppose people would say, and I'd actually heard the e-safety commissioner saying, oh, well, that ship has sailed in terms of the internet, and that it's impossible to get ahead of how fast the internet's unraveling and the new technology, and that they're just doing their best to try and keep pace with the digital world. So possibly that's something to do with these four planets in Sagittarius. But things are changing so fast in the online world and the digital world. it's hard for anyone to keep up, the least of which is the government, of course. Other thing that I noticed here was the square between the Moon and Mercury. Now, when the Moon and Mercury are square in an individual's chart, generally their emotions and their thinking are at odds. And so a person, it's difficult for a person to be clear and rational because their emotional responses cloud their thinking or their communication. So that's a difficult placement on that particular day, because I guess you'd say the Australian populace have been kept in the dark, haven't been told the full information. I think have been deliberately lied to about the changes that came in the wintertime after the trial. They haven't been open and honest about that. So there's misinformation and confusion. And then I noticed that Mercury sits in the 27th degree of Scorpio, which is connected to mental cruelty. And so I can't imagine what it feels like. And I know there have been lots of teenagers who've talked about how their online connections are their sort of saving grace. This is teenagers who, for whatever reason, feel isolated, either because they live regionally isolated or for other reasons, and they really need the connections that they get through the online world. So I wonder whether for some teenagers this is very cruel law, because you know, they will feel persecuted and oppressed by the government around it. I think that's all I'll say about that. And so let's look at what I've termed the softly, softly approach. Why have they done it? Why have they backpedaled? Why have they suddenly said it's not for everybody? Why are they suddenly saying it's okay to use your parents' computers or get your parents' consent? Even though they're not fessing up to the fact that you actually don't have to get your face digitally scanned. I think it's primarily because it's simply not legal in the Australian Constitution. It's very difficult to enforce. There has been a large, certainly online outrage, especially in the last few months in Australia. There's been outrage, public outrage in Britain, and there have actually been riots in Italy, all associated with this global rollout of the digital ID. And of course, it is a very slippery slope, because we have experience where we're told in the past, we're bringing in this new something or other, but don't worry, it's only voluntary. And then a few months later, oh, hang on a minute, now it's required. A few months later, now it's mandatory. Everybody who lived through the pandemic, so-called pandemic in Victoria, saw that slippery slope from what was voluntary to what was required to what was mandatory. And then if you're not careful, you find yourself locked out because you don't comply with what's something that started out to be voluntary. So I'm a little suspicious that even though we have a backpedaling and a softly, softly approach as of the 10th of December, that this is really just the voluntary part. And then I discovered that it's actually, they've called it stage 1. And there's a list of all the current social platforms that are coming under this scrutiny. I confess I don't know about Snapchat. I've never used TikTok. I do use YouTube. Occasionally I'll look at X. I use Facebook. I've never used Instagram or Threads or Reddit or Kik. Now, there was a bit of controversy because initially YouTube was told it would be exempt, and then all of a sudden it was brought in. And of course, the other thing to notice that's very concerning is the parents' companies of most of these social media platforms are America or the USA. So these are the people who are charged with keeping the data safe of users, whether they're from Australia or India or wherever. So if you hand over your personal data, it won't be held in Australia. It will go to Beijing or to the USA, unless you're connected to Kik, which is the only Australian video streaming. And literally only a week ago were these last two added. So that's an example to me of the fact that this is a slippery slope, and at any point they can add on new platforms. And I listened to the e-safety commissioner, and she said that the reason why they're adding new platforms on slowly is because they're trying to make sure that they're not breaking the law. So they're very, very concerned to be on the right side of the law and not to do something that later will come back to bite them. Yes, and of course it is a digital track. Once you hand over your biometric data, you can't get it back. And I discovered that, was it yesterday, today? Yesterday, I think it was, that Zoom, I've used Zoom for, I don't know, 5 years maybe. And of course, I didn't realise it was part of their terms and conditions when you sign up and start an account with Zoom. Not only if you start the account, but if you use Zoom, that Zoom keeps all of your biometric data. Now, up until now, the biometric data, so Zoom say, is kept safe and they don't share it with anyone. Whether you believe that or not, who knows? I also read in their fine print yesterday with Zoom that you can request to have your biometric data back and ask them to trash it. And they say, yes, sure, we'll do that. But you have to be aware that if you ask for that, the quality of your internet connection, primarily the voice, will deteriorate. And I took that to mean to such a point that you then wouldn't be able to use the service. So basically, you'd be punished if you ask for it back. In the fine print of Zoom, they say they don't share it with anybody. Well, maybe they haven't up until now. And they're also saying that they don't use AI without asking for permission. So it's very slippery slopes that are happening. So as far as this digital age assurance compliance, so how are they going to see who's complying and who's not? Well, they're going to assess it on a case-by-case basis. And they're asking for the various platforms, this is X and YouTube and Facebook and such like, to take reasonable steps. But they're not specifying what technological requirements the platforms have to do. All they're saying is that if you don't take reasonable steps, we're going to fine you these huge amounts per person. Yeah. And platforms are told they have to be transparent with consistent policies and dispute resolution process. Well, anybody who's ever tried to have any resolution with Facebook would realise that it's an absolute joke and a laugh to try and get dispute resolution. And I find this laughable because the e-safety commission themselves, they're not transparent. They don't have consistent policies. And who knows what their resolution process is. Yeah, and all of this because it's not legally enforceable. There is no blanket removal for anyone who's suspected to be under 16 unless they have randomly checked into the data. For everybody over 16, you don't have to hand over your digital ID, but they're not telling us that. The reason for all of this is because it's fallible. They have absolutely no idea whether this will work. I forget the phrase they used in this 1,000-page report. They sort of said, well, there were some pros and some cons, basically. So the whole thing is a gigantic experiment. What they are doing is banning anonymous social media accounts. So up until probably, I don't know, the last few years, you could start a social media account in any name you chose and use any photograph you chose. Well, that can no longer happen. Yeah, because even though they don't have the law on their sides, they're hoping that they will frighten people enough that they will just hand over the data. It's very questionable as to whether they can enforce it. They have admitted that it's problematic, that there's all kinds of cracks, but they're maintaining the pretense that it's for safety and privacy. And all they're doing with the platforms is discouraging data retention. Well, I was a bit shocked to realise that Zoom keep all the biometrics and that, yes, the only way to get them back is to basically end your connection with Zoom. And I would assume that any other online video services would be the same. There's the part of the law that says that it's voluntary and that it's illegal for them to insist upon the handing over of the digital ID. So that's Digital ID Act 2004, Section 74. And of course, this is without even getting into the fact that everybody knows that the internet is hacked, you know, quite often for all kinds of reasons. I read somewhere that after they rolled out the digital ID in India, and I can't remember what date it was, I think it was in the last year or so, 800 million Indian people had their personal data and no doubt their biometrics ended up on the dark web to be used for nefarious ends. So it's very, very dangerous. It's absolutely the opposite of safe. So we asked, why on earth would this be rolled out? What on earth is the big picture in the global plan? Because the way I look at it, it's a slippery slope. They say we're protecting children, and they change the language to call it age assurance. That's to cover their backs legally. How on earth is this connected to the closure of banks? What's the connection between this and vaccine mandates? How it can be connected to the withdrawal of cash and digital passports, and this digital ID. It all seems very variable, all these various issues, and yet I look at it and I say they are all connected. They are all links in the chain. There's some talk about the fact that we will need digital verification to use the platforms, Google and Microsoft, down the track. I'll talk a little bit more about that. What could possibly go wrong? So all of these various issues seem very diverse and unrelated, and yet there's something in common. And what's common is that we're constantly told through marketing or propaganda that these things are happening for our safety, for our protection, for our convenience. We'll be being told to saving the planet, to protecting sovereign borders. Yeah. And these are the reasons we're being told that our money, our privacy, our health, our ability to travel is all being confined and constrained through the digital world. And last but not least, we're told that this is for the good of everyone. And I think, well, this is doublespeak. This is blatant 1984 doublespeak. It's the opposite of what's really going on. Nothing could be further from the truth. And then you say, well, why on earth would the democracies do this? You know? Well, the reason I think it's happening is because there's economic collapse or stagnation all around the planet. There's been overreach, there's been government debt, mismanagement of funds. They've gone trillions of dollars into debt in the US, in Europe, all over the Western world, frantically printing money. Effectively, the Western economies are bankrupt. Yeah? US, Germany, France, Britain, Canada. So if the economies are bankrupt, then what they need is a different method of working with money, and this is the digital money. So the global bankers have come up with the solution. It used to be called Agenda 21. Now it's called Agenda 2030. This came through the World Health Organization, and there are many things in it. And if you read Agenda 2030, it sounds like all the goals are very sustainable. It's all to be inclusive. It's all to protect the planet. It's all for better living. It's all a crock of lies as far as I can see, because what they want to do is make money programmable. Yeah, so that everyone has a digital wallet or a digital token. Everybody's money is filtered through, all the banks are filtered through the central bank digital currency, and therefore the global bankers control the global finance. No. And whenever this happens, whenever the reset into the global digital prison, as I call it, when they decide to flip that switch, I believe that what will happen is that all the government debts will be wiped out, but the individual governments will then be beholden to the global banking elite. So this is you know, who's really running the show? Are the governments running the show, or are the global banking elite running the show. So the global banking elite will be running the show. The populace will be surveilled and regulated. The elite will be in control. And we'll have a global control grid. This is the brainchild of the World Health Organization, implemented by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and fast-tracked basically in the last half a dozen years through the Internet of Things, through the rollout of 5G, through AI. And the only way that this can be interrupted is if we recognise what the end goal is of 2030 and refuse to comply. And in that way, we can delay or sabotage it. I think it was just today, 2 days ago, November the 11th. What's this lady's name? Christina, I forget her surname now. I can't read it down the bottom here.
Lagarde.
Christine Lagarde. I thought she used to be in the IMF, but apparently she's now in the European Central Bank. But it was literally 2 days ago, it was announced that large amounts of cash will be illegal, will be criminal. I think it was, gee, I saw the figure now, was it $20,000? You know, and the
10,000 euros.
Yeah.
10,000.
Thanks. Yeah, €10,000. Yeah. So to deal with money more than €10,000, it's actually going to be a criminal. You'll be a criminal. And this is because they're trying to wipe out cash before the digital euro launch. And they expect the digital euro to be launched by December, the end of next year. Yeah, so this is all part and parcel of the planning. It's been going on for at least a decade, I think, probably longer. And Australia has been dragged into it. And there will be some payoff for the Australian government, but there will be a price to pay for all the citizens. And of course, we've seen this before. We've experienced what happened with the COVID. It was a trial run, went for 2 or 3 years, depending upon what state you're in. And we have another similar rollout. And we need to recognise what's happening, resist, refuse to comply, step outside of the grid. Because this rollout is going 2024, at least from the Australian perspective, through until, who knows, 2030 is their end game. Yes, so we have a Trojan horse. We're doing this for the safety of the children, and we're telling blatant lies. And of course, the COVID was the precedent. We had the QR codes, and it became normalised. I'm quite shocked to see that the QR codes are still used, and they're a normal part of Australian society here years after the lockdown. So we have this precedent where it's just people expect and they become accustomed to the fact that they have to hand over their data. We're told that it's safe and efficient. Really, it's just surveillance. We're told that it's convenient, and maybe it is, but it means that your privacy and your access to social media is only there if you comply. You know, you may have noticed also in your computer, and I have several times, Microsoft will say it wants to give you an upgrade, and then after the upgrade, all kinds of things are changed on your computer or they don't work. Many people have experienced that. Well, it's almost inevitable that we will not only have stage 1, 10 December, or stage 2, 27th of December, but who knows what stage 3 or 4 are coming next year. There will be upgrades, and I'm deeply suspicious that somehow or other they'll find a way of forcing the people into the biometric trap. Senator Alex Antic says, with this digital ID bill, we continue to tiptoe or walk blindfoldedly into a future in which the government exercises more control over what you can and cannot do based on your compliance with their agenda. Never a truer word was spoken. And because everybody's lived through the lockdowns, and particularly the Victorians who saw exactly what happens when power overtakes a government, we have to be wary. The rollouts happened in China, Europe, Australia, different names, same story. So refuse, and I think really it's extremely important to keep using cash, because the moment you succumb, and yes, it's easy and it's convenient and the plastic and all of that, but if you stop using it, then they say, well, nobody uses the cash, that's why we've closed the banks. And then they say, well, nobody's using the cash, that's why we're shifting to a digital economy. So the cash is very important. The global warriors. There aren't very many parliamentarians in Australia who's speaking up about this. We have Senator Alex Antic, South Australian Liberal. We have Senator Gerard Rennick from People First in Queensland. I think he's Gympie, I think. Malcolm Roberts, he's One Nation. I'm not sure where he's based, maybe Queensland also.
Senator Brisbane.
Is he? Yeah. Senator Matt Canavan from the Nationals. So we have across the board, Bridget Archer, the only Liberal who refused to rubber stamp it when this law went through the Australian Parliament, and all of the Greens. So these are the ones that know what's going on, or value the freedom of the individuals. And I find it really interesting. You know, this is the cross-section of Australian parliamentarians and senators. Yes. So they're the people to support, they're the people to listen to, because they understand what's happening. Here's an interesting quote. These programs, mass surveillance is not about public safety. It is not about terrorism. It is about power. It is about economic espionage. It's about diplomatic manipulation, and it's about social influence. I don't know when Edward Snowden said that. He's been living in Russia for, gosh, at least a decade, since he exposed things in America and became public enemy #1. So here's phase 2 that I didn't even know about until a couple of days ago. Starts on the 27th of December, and the government says they expect phase 2 to be made law by, I don't know whether it's the middle or the end of March. So what is phase 2? Well, phase 2 are the industry codes. So this is not targeting you and me, the general populace. This is targeting the various platforms, asking, and they're continuing to use the word verification there. So I don't know why they haven't got rid of that and started to use the word assurance. So on the 27th of December, all the hosting services, and I've just listed a few of them here, Amazon, Shopify, Wix, WordPress, that's how I run my website, Squarespace, Google, a lot of people use, Microsoft, are asking, they have to go through the same process. And when I dug deeper, I discovered that it's not compulsory, that because, say, for instance, I have a WordPress account, I won't be obliged to hand over my digital ID, but they will be actively offering and suggesting and hoping not to all their people that this is what you have to do. Whereas when I read the fine print, I realised it's voluntary. I don't have to do it. Yeah, but it'd be interesting to see whether all of these various platforms, and that's just a few of them, tell their customers that it's voluntary, or whether they just hope that people think they have to hand it over. The same with the internet carriage service. So whether you're with Dodo or TPG or Optus or Telstra or NBN, it's voluntary. Yeah. Whether they tell the public that or not, we don't know. Similarly with the search engines, I had a look because I've been using Brave for many months now, and I went on to Brave and they say, no, it's voluntary and we're keeping it voluntary. How long that lasts, we don't know. But I asked the question for 2026, is it going to be mandatory? If I use these search engines, if I use my WordPress website, then no, it's still voluntary. So that appears to be good news in the short term, at least for 2026. Yeah. But there are compulsory things, and this is the list of compulsory things. If you go along and buy something from, say, an Apple distribution platform, yeah, if I want to buy something from iTunes, for instance, it's compulsory. Yeah. Any equipment providers, and I don't quite know what the social media core and messaging features are, but clearly, you know, you kind of have to really dig into it to understand what's voluntary and what's compulsory. Electronic services, and who knows what this means, designated internet services. The deadline for compliance, I think it's the end of March. And the only good ones that I could see were pornographic sites or AI companion chatbots that old people or teenagers are talking to, or the people who are manufacturing the technology. So this is stage 2 coming in the end of December. So it'll be interesting to find out if I suddenly try and buy something, let's say on iTunes, and they go, oh, well, actually, you can't use your iTunes account anymore if you fail to comply because it will be compulsory. So my suggestion is if you want new equipment or if you're going to deal with anything on this list here, do it before March. Yeah. Very brief look at the chart here for the 27th of December. This is phase 2. So in the earlier chart for the 10th of December, there were 4 planets in Sagittarius, but now we have 4 planets in Capricorn. This is far more serious. This is like a triple lock. Yeah. And again, we see the Grand Cross. Now, maybe that's because I've put it for midnight. But certainly all that Capricorn tells me this is far more serious, phase 2. So I take phase 1 to be the sort of the light and friendly with lots of loopholes, but phase 2, it's getting serious. Again, I looked at the Pluto, yeah, and I've noticed, now what is it there? Pluto's in a semi-sextile this time to the Sun and Venus and the Earth. And as I said, I think this is the strong arm of the digital compliance. And the Pluto's fairly weak. There aren't many aspects to it. And the Sabian symbol is a deserter from the Navy. Well, I hope that a lot of Australians desert this sinking ship of the compliance. We have the Pisces stellium in the 6th house, which is the day-to-day work environment. And I did read somewhere that it's the government departments that will be locked into compliance. And I assume that means state and federal and maybe even local council, but not your average business owner. Yeah. The 4 planets, the 3 planets in Pisces and the North Node in Pisces may be that a whole lot of people think it's a non-event, a non-issue. What's the harm? Just go along with it. They haven't got the information. They've been lied to. They don't realise that the water's been muddied and therefore they comply. I did notice also that the nodes are stationary. Hard to know. Normally when the transiting nodes, that's an imaginary point in the zodiac that's associated with matters to do with the past and the future. And when the nodes are stationary, it's a bit like a very important point in time. It's like a frozen point in time. And the nodes are stationary from the end of December until the 9th of January, except for one day, I think, where they look like they're moving. So I suppose we won't really know what sort of an impact this rollout of stage 2 will happen on business until after the 9th of January. And then I looked at the date and I thought, well, this is very sneaky. They bring in phase 2 and everybody's on holidays. A whole lot of businesses are shut down. You know, everything's on pause for the Christmas, the New Year break. It's a very sneaky time, it seems to me, to bring in such serious legislation. Okay, let's have a look at the past, the present and the future. I was trying to find some good news. You may have seen this online. Denmark recently etched its name into the digital rights frontier by officially recognising the human face, excuse me, body and voice as intellectual property. This groundbreaking move treats personal, physical and vocal attributes not just as biometric data, but as elements of identity worthy of protection under copyright-like frameworks. By placing legal ownership over what makes us visibly and audibly human, Denmark has initiated a global conversation that transcends privacy. Sorry, I've got a tickle in my throat. Transcends privacy, enters the terrain of identity sovereignty. It marks one of the most assertive governmental responses yet to the evolving deep fake dilemma. So this seems incredible, fantastic, good on you, Denmark. Apparently, this was the middle of 2025. They're sort of saying, hang on a minute, your biometric data is under individual copyright. This seems to go in the opposite direction to the Internet of Things. Fantastic. But then in the same breath, Denmark have literally very recently brought in digital age verification for the under 15s. Now, I only saw that on the 11th of November. I don't know when it actually happened. So there seems to be a fantastic sense of grabbing identity and the copyright for the DNA, and yet bowing to the digital age verification. A little bit confusing. Talked about we know what happened in the past with COVID, no vaccination, no work. You couldn't see your family, you couldn't see your friends, you couldn't travel interstate. You had to comply. Same thing's happening in Britain right now. No digital ID, no work. I was astounded to discover that 12,000 British people per annum are arrested in their own homes because they've posted something on their social media that the government considers to be suspicious. This is adults and children. I don't know for how long, but that's 12,000 in 2024, I think it was. Yeah, we've also seen what happens when the internet goes down, when we have natural disasters, when the internet's hacked, the governments, agencies or the banks are affected. We end up in a state of emergency. Okay, we've all seen all of that in the past and the present. I also discovered that there are very few email services that are encrypted. Proton's one of them. And I realised with a little bit of looking around that this has actually been banned, because I heard that, I think it was the British government was saying we're going to ban encryptions. And then I realised that the only place on the planet thus far that has banned encrypted email is India. And they did that in April this year because of, I forget why, but anyway, it's actually banned in India. There's been also talk that the virtual private networks, the VPNs, will be banned. Maybe I'm confused. Maybe Britain were trying to ban the VPNs. I don't know who it was banning the emails. Could have been Britain. A little bit more digging, and I realised it's very unlikely. This is just a lot of hot air. They may restrict the use of VPNs for the under 15s or 16s, but very unlikely that it will actually be banned. I also heard someone say that it might be possible that we'd have to show digital ID to use any device at all. A little bit of digging, and I realise this is, again, not on the cards, very unlikely to happen, although it wouldn't surprise me if they brought this in once the baby boomers are gone, 2030, 2035, that kind of a time frame. The Australian government has what they've called the Australian Government Digital ID System. And as I mentioned before, there are some things that are above the law that remain optional. You will not have to hand your digital ID over to pay your taxes, to access government services, Medicare or Centrelink. That's not to say that they're still actively encouraging everybody to do it, but it's illegal and they can't force people. Other things that are currently optional but have been flagged for change by the end of 2026. This is accessing your own money with the banking, renewing your driver's license and or superannuation. I couldn't see anything that was definite one way or the other, but it appeared as if those things might be mown down with the digital prison by the end of next year. The thing that we know in Australia is compulsory thus far is your passport and travel. You cannot leave the country now unless you have the digital ID. So a little bit of good news, but I think forewarned is forearmed. There are some of the links that I've been sharing, various links there. And thank you for your attention. That completes the talk this evening.